The morning Eleanor Ashford signed her name to a marriage contract, she told herself it was nothing more than ink on paper, a transaction as cold and calculated as any business deal her late father had ever brokered in the drawing rooms of Boston. She sat at the rough-hewn table of Mr. Gerald Fitch's land office in Abilene, Kansas, on a sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1873, pressing her pen to a document that promised her hand to one Mr. Cole Harding of the Red Creek Ranch, a man she had never met, never corresponded with beyond 2 brief letters, and whose only recommendation was that he owned 300 acres of good cattle land and had paid her passage west from Boston without so much as a complaint about the cost. Eleanor told herself this was enough. Eleanor told herself she was a practical woman. She had been a practical woman for most of her 24 years. When her father died of a heart ailment 2 winters prior, leaving behind nothing but a mortgaged house and a mountain of debt that his creditors had descended upon like vultures on a drought-killed steer, Eleanor had not wept long. She had packed what remained of her dignity into a single leather trunk, taken a position as a seamstress in the shop of Mrs. Holcomb on Tremont Street, and begun the quiet, exhausting work of surviving. She had no brothers. She had no surviving mother. She had an aunt in Providence who had written once to say she was sorry for Eleanor's troubles and had not written again. So when the advertisement appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript, placed by a land broker acting on behalf of ranchers in Kansas who required wives of good character and sound mind, Eleanor had read it twice, folded the paper, put it in her sewing basket, taken it out 3 days later, read it a 3rd time, and then written her letter. She had been entirely honest in that letter. She was not beautiful in any remarkable way, she wrote. She was capable, literate, and in good health. She could cook adequately, so excellently, keep accounts, and had been told she had a pleasant enough temperament when she was not tired. She did not expect romance. She expected a partnership. She hoped Mr. Harding would feel similarly. His reply had been brief and businesslike, which had impressed her. He wrote that he needed a capable woman to manage the household and, in time, raise children. He would provide a home, food, and a fair share of whatever the ranch produced. He did not write anything about love. Eleanor had appreciated that very much. What she had not anticipated, as she signed her name in Mr. Fitch's office and felt the dry Kansas wind push through the open door and scatter a few loose papers across the floorboards, was that Cole Harding would be standing in the doorway at that exact moment, having ridden into town an hour early, watching her with dark, steady eyes beneath the brim of a weather-beaten hat. He was taller than she had imagined. Not in a theatrical way, not the sort of tall that announced itself loudly, but tall in the way that a man who has spent years on horseback tends to be, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the hip, with hands that looked as though they had made and fixed and built a great many things. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor since at least Tuesday. There was dust on his coat and a scar along his left forearm that disappeared into his rolled sleeve, and he was watching her with an expression that she could not immediately place. She placed her pen down, blotted the signature, and stood. "Mr. Harding," she said, keeping her voice level and professional because this was a professional arrangement. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary syllables. He crossed the room and shook her hand, and his grip was firm but careful, as if he understood the difference between strength and force. Mr. Fitch, a portly man with perpetually moist cheeks, beamed at them both. "Well, now that the principals are present, we can proceed to the ceremony first thing tomorrow morning. Reverend Dalton has been notified. The Grand Hotel on Meridian Street has a room reserved for Miss Ashford tonight, courtesy of Mr. Harding." "Thank you," Eleanor said to Cole, and she meant it practically, the way one thanks a business associate for covering a legitimate expense. Cole nodded. He was still looking at her in that unidentifiable way. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that had not been among them. "I beg your pardon. You've been on the train since Topeka, I expect, and before that longer. Are you hungry?" There was no impatience in his question. He asked it the way a person asks when they genuinely want to know. "I suppose I am," she admitted. "There's a good place down the street. Best beef stew in Abilene, which isn't saying a great deal, but it's honest food." He picked up her leather trunk, hefting it as though it weighed nothing, and gestured toward the door with the ease of a man who had decided something and was moving toward it without ceremony. Eleanor followed him, because there was nothing else sensible to do, and because the smell of beef stew suddenly struck her as the finest thing she had imagined in weeks. They sat across from one another in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and Eleanor discovered that Cole Harding ate quietly and without spectacle, which she considered a virtue. He asked her about the train journey. She told him it had been long and that the sleeping car had smelled of tobacco and someone's boots. He said that was usually the case. She asked him how far the ranch was from Abilene. He said a day's ride southeast, that the road was good most of the way, that there was a creek crossing that could be tricky in spring but was simple enough in summer. "You didn't write much in your letters," she said, because she was a practical woman and practical women address things directly. He looked up from his stew. "No, I'm not much for letters. You should know that I am also not given to excessive sentiment," she said. "I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I think we should understand each other's expectations before tomorrow." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, not amusement exactly. Something that might have been consideration, or perhaps something quieter and more careful than that. "I read your letter 3 times, he said. She was surprised enough that she did not immediately respond. "You were honest in it," he continued. "That mattered to me. I'm not a man who wants to be fooled about what he's getting, and I figured you deserved the same. I'm not easy company. I work long hours. The ranch needs a lot, but I mean what I signed my name to." He paused. "I want you to know that." Eleanor looked at him across the table. The evening light through the window was orange and thick with dust motes, and somewhere outside a horse stamped and a man called out to someone about the time. "I appreciate the candor," she said carefully. "Do you?" He studied her. "Because you look like you're calculating something." She was startled into an honest laugh, brief and small but genuine. "I suppose I am," she said. "I'm trying to determine whether you are the kind of man who says he means what he signs and then means it, or the kind who believes he does but has a different understanding of what was signed." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I reckon that's a fair thing to wonder," he said finally. "I'll just have to show you." She looked back at her stew. It was, in fact, quite good. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you will." The wedding took place the following morning in the small white Methodist church on the corner of Elm and 2nd Street, with Reverend Dalton presiding and Mr. Fitch and his wife serving as witnesses. It was a plain ceremony, the kind that 2 practical people arrange when they have decided to get something done. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was navy blue with cream lace at the collar, because she was practical but not indifferent to appearing respectable. Cole wore a clean coat and had shaved, which she noticed and appreciated without saying so. When Reverend Dalton reached the vows, Cole spoke them in a voice that was steady and unhurried, looking directly at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Eleanor felt something odd and small move through her, like a current beneath still water. She spoke her own vows in the same clear, practical tone she might use to confirm the terms of a contract. Because that was what this was. She told herself that 3 times before they stepped back out into the Kansas morning sunlight, and Cole Harding placed his hand briefly on the small of her back to guide her around a loose board on the church steps, and she told herself it again. The road to Red Creek Ranch took them through country that Eleanor had not imagined, and she had imagined quite a bit of it during her journey west. She had expected flat, featureless plains, the kind of bleak nothing that the newspapers back east seemed to associate with Kansas. But the land they moved through was something more complicated and alive than that. The tall grass rolled in waves that caught the light and threw it back golden, And the sky was a blue so deep and absolute it looked almost impossible, the kind of blue that made the horizon feel like a promise rather than an ending. Meadowlarks called from fence posts and the scattered bluestem, and in the distance a line of cottonwoods traced the path of what she assumed was a creek. She rode beside Cole in the wagon, her trunk secured in the bed behind them, and she found herself watching the land unfold with a feeling she could not entirely name. It was not exactly wonder, she told herself. Wonder was a luxury. It was more like reassessment. The calculation of a practical woman confronted with data she had not included in her original model. "What do you raise?" she asked. "Cattle, mainly. Black Angus and some Texas Longhorn. 20 head right now, looking to expand to 40 by spring." He guided the horses around a gentle bend in the trail. "I have 2 hands who bunk in the smaller outbuilding, Tom Waverly and a man named Esperanza who everyone calls Espe. Good workers, both of them. Tom's been with me 4 years. Espe came up with a cattle drive from Texas 2 years back and stayed on. Are their neighbors. The Millers are 5 miles east. Good people. Mary Miller has been very forthcoming with advice about the ranch. And about," he stopped briefly, and she understood without his finishing the sentence that Mary Miller had been offering advice about what sort of woman Cole ought to find, and perhaps about the arrangement that had brought Eleanor here. "She'll want to call on you soon. She's a kind woman." "I look forward to it," Eleanor said, and mostly meant it, because she thought she could use one friend. Red Creek Ranch appeared in the late afternoon, when the light had shifted to amber and the shadows stretched long and lean across the grass. The house was bigger than she had expected, bigger than the few words Cole had offered in his letter had suggested. It was not grand, not by any Boston measure, but it was solidly built of good timber and stone, with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front, and windows on the upper floor that she supposed were bedrooms. A kitchen garden ran along the south side, somewhat weedy but clearly established, and a large barn sat back from the house with a corral beside it, where 3 horses watched their arrival with mild interest. Tom Waverly came out of the barn as they pulled up, a lean and sun-browned man of perhaps 40 with a friendly, weathered face, and he tipped his hat to Eleanor and said, "Welcome to Red Creek, ma'am," with a genuine warmth that helped something in her chest relax a degree. Espe appeared shortly after, a short and strongly built man with a broad smile who also greeted her respectfully, and then helped Cole with the horses while Tom carried her trunk to the porch. Cole unlocked the front door and pushed it open and stood aside for her to enter. The main room was spare but clean, a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the window, shelves of books which surprised her considerably. She crossed to look at them while Cole set her trunk down and she ran her fingers along the spines. Dickens, a volume of Shakespeare, 2 books on cattle management, a Bible with a worn spine. A collection of poetry she recognized as belonging to the Romantic period, Keats and Shelley and Byron, which surprised her most of all. "You read," she said. "I do," he said, as though this required no further elaboration. She turned to look at him. "The poetry particularly surprised me. My mother's," he said simply. "She thought a person ought to read everything they could get their hands on. I tend to agree." She filed this away and continued her inspection of the house. The kitchen was functional and reasonably equipped. The staircase was solid and did not creak excessively. Upstairs there were 2 rooms, the larger one clearly intended as the main bedroom, with a proper bed and a chest of drawers and a washstand, and a smaller room that appeared to be used for storage. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, and the practical architecture of what marriage meant, even a business marriage, asserted itself. Cole was in the hallway behind her. "I've thought about this," he said with characteristic directness, "and I want to say something." She turned to face him. "I'm not going to pretend that we know each other well enough for things to be other than what they are," he said. "We're strangers who made an agreement. I intend to honor that agreement in every respect. but I also think he seemed to be choosing his words with the same care he might use to lay a foundation stone. I think we should give each other some time. Before anything is expected that isn't, he stopped. Eleanor understood him precisely. She also understood that he was giving her something she had not known to ask for, and that it was a considerable kindness. I think that is very sensible, she said, keeping her voice steady. Thank you, he nodded. The smaller room is cleared out enough to use, if you'd prefer. She looked at the smaller room and then at the larger, and she made a practical decision. I'll take the larger room for now, she said. It seems the more sensible arrangement. Something shifted in his expression again. That's something she could not name. Good, he said, and went downstairs to see about supper. The first weeks were, by Eleanor's careful and private accounting, something of a revelation, though she would not have used that word to anyone including herself. She had expected the work to be hard. It was. She had not expected it to be so entirely engaging. There were 100 things to learn about keeping a household in this country. 100 ways in which her Boston education had prepared her for nothing that this land required, and she threw herself into learning with the focused intensity that had always been her dominant characteristic. Mary Miller, who appeared at the door 3 days after Eleanor's arrival in a wagon driven by her good-natured husband Frank, was exactly as warm and capable as Cole had suggested. A broad-shouldered woman of 35 who had been on the frontier for 9 years, and who had opinions on everything from bread baking to cattle prices to the behavior of the local sheriff, all of which she delivered without malice and with considerable humor. Eleanor liked her immediately and without reservation. He's a good man, Cole Harding, Mary told her on that first afternoon, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table while Eleanor made coffee. He's private, and people sometimes mistake that for cold. He isn't cold. He just doesn't spend himself on things that don't matter. I've noticed that, Eleanor said, which was the closest she would come to admitting that she had been observing her husband with an attention that was possibly not entirely clinical. Cole, for his part, was true to every word he had spoken in that Abilene restaurant. He worked long hours and came to the table tired, but he was not short with her, not once. He ate what she cooked without complaint, and when she made mistakes, which she did regularly in those first weeks, he either said nothing or said something useful, never something unkind. He fixed the kitchen pump when it began to stick without being asked. He cleared the weeds from the kitchen garden on a Sunday afternoon and showed her which plants were established perennials and which had been allowed to go wild. He brought her a length of good calico from town when he made a supply run, without ceremony, setting it on the table and saying that he thought she might want more fabric for whatever she might need it for, which was not a particularly elegant gift, but struck her as evidence of someone who had noticed she sewed and thought about what that might require. In the evenings when supper was cleared, he sometimes read, she sometimes sewed. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which she found interesting and did not analyze overmuch. Occasionally one of them would say something, a comment about something they were reading, a question about the ranch or about some practical matter, and then the silence would settle again, easy and unhurried. She began to sleep well, which surprised her. She had not slept well in Boston for 2 years. The crisis arrived 6 weeks into their marriage in the form of a man named Clayton Rao. Clayton Rao was a land speculator from Wichita who had been acquiring parcels throughout the region, and who appeared at the ranch one morning while Cole was out on the south pasture with Tom and Espe, moving cattle to a different grazing area. He arrived in a fine buggy with a man beside him who said nothing, and had the look of someone paid to be useful in unpleasant situations, and he knocked at the front door, and when Eleanor answered, he presented his card and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. He wanted to discuss the purchase of Red Creek Ranch, he said. He represented interests who were consolidating land in this region for significant purposes. He named a figure that Eleanor recognized as deliberately low, and he delivered it with the confident air of a man who expects to be thanked for his generosity. Eleanor stood in her doorway and looked at him for a moment. "My husband is not available at present," she said clearly. "You are welcome to return when he is." "I've spoken with your husband previously," Rao said, still smiling. "He wasn't receptive. I thought perhaps a different conversation might be productive." Women, in my experience, tend to see the practical advantages of a secure financial arrangement more clearly than men in Mr. Harding's position. She felt the specific cold clarity that always settled over her when someone attempted to be condescending in a sophisticated way. "Mr. Rao," she said, "I was a businesswoman's daughter who managed accounts at 14 and kept a household solvent under considerable difficulty for 2 years. I understand practical advantages very well. And I understand precisely what you are attempting to do here, which is to use my assumed ignorance or malleable sentiment to accomplish something my husband has already declined to allow." She paused. "This land is not for sale. I suggest you direct your conversation to the legal record." Rao's smile did not disappear, but it contracted. "Mrs. Harding," he said, "I hope you'll reconsider. The men I represent are not always patient." "I expect they are not," she said, and closed the door. When Cole came in for the midday meal and she told him about the visit with the full and precise detail that she considered appropriate, his jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before, and for a moment he was very still. Then he said, "You all right?" She was slightly startled. "Of course." He was unpleasant but not threatening. Well, he implied a threat, but a generalized one. Cole's eyes met hers across the kitchen. "I should have been here. You could not have known he was coming." "No," he was quiet for a moment. "He's been trying to buy up land along the creek for 6 months. 3 families have sold, 2 because they wanted to and 1 because they felt they had to." His voice was level, but she had by now learned to hear what was underneath it, and what was underneath it now was controlled anger. "I won't sell this place. My father built it." She had not known that. He did not speak of his family often. "Tell me about your father," she said, which surprised both of them because it was not a practical question. Cole looked at her for a beat. Then he sat down at the table, and she poured the coffee she had been keeping warm and sat across from him. And he talked about his father, Daniel Harding, who had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1858 with very little money and a great deal of stubbornness, and had built the ranch house with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. He had died of a fever when Cole was 19, leaving the ranch to his only son, and Cole had kept it going through drought and cattle prices that nearly broke him twice, and weather that had done its honest best. "That land is everything he worked for," Cole said, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms. "I'm not giving it to a man like Rel for any price." "Good," Eleanor said, and meant it with a firmness she had not anticipated. He looked at her. In the kitchen light, in the quiet of the midday, something between them felt different from what it had been before, though she could not precisely account for what had shifted or when it had happened. "You could have just told him to come back when I was here," he said quietly. "You didn't have to say all that." "I did not want him to think he could come here and speak to me as though I were a piece of furniture he could maneuver at will," she said. A slow, warm smile crossed Cole's face, the first real one she had seen from him, unhurried and entirely genuine, and it changed his face so considerably that she sat there looking at it for a moment longer than she should have. "No," he said, "I don't imagine that ever worked on you." "Not once in my life," she agreed, and found herself smiling back before she had decided to. That evening he brought his chair a little closer to the fire than he usually did, and they read in companionable silence for an hour. And once when he found a passage in his book that pleased him, he read it aloud, and she listened. And then she found a passage in her own book and read that aloud, and he listened with his full attention, and neither of them commented on the fact that this was new. October came to the Kansas plains like a slow and golden ceremony, turning the grasses amber and copper, and setting the cottonwoods along Red Creek alight with color so bright. It sometimes stopped Eleanor mid-step when she came around the side of the house to the garden. She had cleaned and replanted the kitchen garden in the weeks after her arrival, getting advice from Mary Miller and making more than a few errors and learning from them. And now the garden was producing well enough that she had begun to put up preserves, filling the cellar shelves with sealed jars of tomato and apple, and the dense sweet plum jam that she had discovered she was particularly good at making. She also discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she had opinions about the cattle operation. This happened because Cole had gotten into the habit of talking through the ranch's business at the supper table, not specifically to include her, she thought, but simply because he was thinking aloud and she happened to be there, and because she was a woman who had always been constitutionally incapable of listening to a problem without forming a response to it. And so one evening, when he was working through the question of which cattle to sell at the fall market and which to keep through winter, she said, without quite planning to, "You'd have a better return keeping the younger breeding stock and selling the older animals, wouldn't you? Even at a lower per-head price, the long-term value of the breeding herd seems greater." Cole had looked at her with the expression she had begun to associate with recalibration, as if he was taking a measurement of something and finding the result required adjusting his instruments. "How do you know about breeding stock value?" he asked. "I don't know about cattle particularly," she said, "but the principle is the same as any inventory question. You hold what appreciates and sell what has reached its peak value." He considered this seriously for a long moment, not dismissing it, not flattering it, just actually thinking about it. Then he said, "Tom said much the same thing last week." "I think you're both right." She was unreasonably pleased by this. She recognized that she was unreasonably pleased and found she did not particularly care. After that, the conversation about ranch business became regular at the supper table, and Cole began asking her questions rather than simply thinking aloud. And she began asking questions of her own, and learning more rapidly than she would have expected. And she found herself standing at the kitchen window on a November morning, watching the cattle in the south pasture with what she could only describe as proprietary interest. The fall cattle sale in Abilene brought them both into town for 3 days, and on the second evening after the business was successfully concluded, Cole suggested they have supper at the hotel restaurant, which was a considerably grander establishment than the beef stew place they had visited the day of their wedding. Eleanor put on her good dress and pinned her hair more carefully than she had bothered to do in months, and when she came downstairs Cole was waiting by the front door of the hotel, and he looked at her for a moment before he said anything, just looked. And then he said, "You look very fine, Eleanor," in a voice that was quieter than his usual tone. She felt warmth move through her from somewhere behind her sternum, which she noted with clinical detachment, and then chose not to detach from clinically. "Thank you," she said. They sat at a white-clothed table and had a proper dinner with real china, and they talked about the sale results, and about a mare Cole was considering buying from a neighboring ranch, and about a book she was partway through, and about whether they ought to add a root cellar to the house before the deep cold came. None of these were romantic subjects. The feeling between them, nonetheless, was something she could no longer accurately describe as businesslike. "Can I ask you something?" she said over the apple pie that arrived at the end of the meal. "Always," he said. "Why did you advertise for a wife?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over in his hand. "I'd been running the ranch alone for 8 years. I had the land and the stock and the work, and that was fine." But he seemed to be considering how to say it. "My father always said that a place like Red Creek isn't truly a home unless there's more than one person in it." I thought he was being sentimental. He paused. "I don't think that anymore." She looked at him across the white tablecloth in the warm light of the restaurant. This man with the quiet voice and the bookshelves and the careful hands and the steadiness that never wavered, and she felt something she had been carefully not acknowledging for some time now make itself impossible to ignore. "I thought this was a business arrangement," she said. "I know," he said. "When I signed that contract," she said slowly, "I told myself it was practical. That sentiment was a luxury I could not afford." "I know," he said again, watching her. "I may have been wrong about that," she said, with the measured precision she always used when admitting something difficult. Something in his face opened, quietly and completely, the way a room opens when you lift the blinds and the light comes in. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name was unlike any of the other times he had said it. "I meant those vows." She had known that, she realized. She had known it from the moment he had spoken them, steady-eyed and unhurried in the small white church in Abilene. She had simply been insisting to herself that it did not matter. "I know," she said, and heard the echo of his own words with a private warmth. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers lightly, the way he did everything, with care rather than force. She turned her hand over and curled her fingers through his, and they sat like that for a long moment with the noise of the restaurant moving softly around them, and she thought that, whatever else she had been wrong about in her life, she was not wrong about this. The ride back to Red Creek the following morning was easy and bright, the winter not yet harsh, the sky pale blue and enormous, and Eleanor sat beside Cole on the wagon seat with their shoulders touching, and the easy silence of people who have said something important and do not need to keep saying it. Clayton Rell, however, had not finished. On a cold Thursday in November, Tom came up from the barn in the early evening with his face tight and said that 3 of the young steers in the east pasture had been found with a section of fence cut, 2 of them gone and 1 lamed. Cole was out in the barn before Tom finished the sentence, and Eleanor pulled her coat on and followed, because she had decided some time ago that things which affected Red Creek affected her. The cut fence was clearly deliberate. Clean cuts, not breaks. Cole stood looking at it in the last light of the afternoon, his jaw set, and Tom stood beside him saying nothing useful but feeling it. "Rell," Eleanor said, because it seemed logical. "Likely," Cole said. "Can't prove it." He turned back toward the ranch. "We'll increase the watch. I'll talk to Frank Miller tomorrow. We're not the only ones he's pressuring." The neighboring ranchers, it turned out, had been experiencing similar harassment. A fence cut here. Cattle spooked there. A barn door found open that should have been latched. Nothing that rose to the level of something the county sheriff, a man named Briggs who had a known friendliness with men of means, would act upon, but enough to wear on people. Enough to make the older or less established families consider Rell's buyout offers more seriously. Cole organized a meeting at the Miller Ranch, and Eleanor went with him, and 5 families gathered around Frank Miller's kitchen and talked through what was happening and what could be done. There were arguments about whether to go over Briggs's head to the federal marshal's office in Topeka, and about whether a unified refusal to sell would be sufficient protection, and about what the legal position was regarding intimidation that was hard to prove. Eleanor, who had sat quietly through the first portion of the meeting, said, "The land records." Everyone looked at her. If Rell is purchasing parcels along the creek corridor, there is a purpose to the specific parcels he's targeting. If we look at the land records in Abilene and map out which parcels he has already acquired, we may be able to determine what he actually wants. Understanding his goal might give us legal or practical leverage that simply refusing to sell does not. There was a moment of silence, and then Frank Miller said, "That's a good idea," in the tone of a man who means it fully. Cole was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, had been recognizing with increasing clarity over the past weeks, as something that in another person, in another life, she might have simply called love. She did not look away from it. They went to Abilene the following week and spent 2 full days at the land office, Eleanor going through the records with the focused patience she had developed working accounts in Boston, drawing a rough map on the back of a piece of brown paper, marking each parcel Rell had acquired with a careful X when she was finished, and she and Cole spread the map on the table of their hotel room. It was immediately obvious. "The creek," Cole said. "He's trying to control the water access," Eleanor said. "If he owns the parcels here, here, and here," she traced the line with her finger, "he controls where the water can be legally diverted for irrigation. The railroad is planning an expansion south. Irrigation rights along this corridor would be worth a tremendous amount of money." Cole straightened and looked at the map for a long moment. "This is bigger than I thought." "Yes, She was already thinking ahead. There is a provision in the Homestead Act regulations and subsequent Kansas land law about riparian rights, water access rights, that may make the kind of control he is seeking more difficult to establish than he realizes if the existing landowners formally register their water use. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I read 2 books on Kansas land law when I arrived," she said. "I thought it would be useful to understand what I had married into." He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor Harding," with a quiet, warm emphasis on her name that did something entirely undeniable to her heartbeat. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." She felt heat rise to her cheeks, which was not something she was accustomed to. "I am a practical woman," she said, and could hear herself that the words rang a little differently than they used to. He stepped around the table and stood close enough that she had to tilt her face up to look at him, and he put one hand against her face with the same care he gave everything, and he said, "May I kiss you, Eleanor?" The asking of it, she thought, was the thing. Not just the action, but the asking. The belief that her answer mattered, that she was a person with a voice he wanted to hear rather than a signature on a contract. "Yes," she said, and he did, and it was quiet and unhurried and thorough, and she placed her hands against the lapels of his coat and held on. When they came back from Abilene with the map and the information and a letter of introduction to a land law attorney named Whitmore in Topeka, that a helpful clerk at the land office had provided after Eleanor had explained the situation to him clearly, and at some length, the neighboring families were ready to listen. Whitmore traveled down from Topeka in December and met with the ranchers, and he confirmed Eleanor's interpretation of the riparian rights law. And within a month, all 5 families along the creek corridor had properly registered their water access rights and sent a letter through Whitmore to Rail's backers in Wichita making clear that the legal landscape was not what they had assumed. The harassment ceased. Rail himself was seen in Abilene in January, but he did not come to Red Creek, and by February the land broker's office closed. The threat was over. Mary Miller came to call in the week after Whitmore's good news arrived, and she sat at Eleanor's kitchen table with coffee and said, "I always thought Cole needed someone exactly like you," with a smile that communicated rather more than those words alone. "I'm not sure anyone is exactly like me," Eleanor said. "No," Mary agreed. "That's rather the point." Winter settled over the ranch fully, and it was different from what Eleanor had imagined winter to be in this country. It was not the gray, damp cold of Boston winters, which had always felt to her like a personal grievance the sky had with the city. This winter was brilliant and savage and honest, with nights so clear the stars felt close enough to touch and mornings of startling bright blue silence after a snow, the plains perfectly white and unmarked, the cold having a clean quality that she found, to her own surprise, invigorating rather than punishing. She and Cole existed together in the warmth of the house through the long evenings, and what existed between them now was no longer careful or held at arm's length. There was a tenderness in how he was with her that she thought he had probably always been capable of, and had simply never shown anyone, and she found herself returning it with a naturalness that surprised her, because she had always believed tenderness was a thing she kept carefully rationed. He taught her to ride properly, on a patient bay mare named Bess, in the corralled area south of the barn on the milder winter days, and she was not immediately good at it, but she was determined, and he was a good teacher, patient and clear and never condescending. By February she could manage a canter without terror, and by March she was riding the fields beside him on the early morning check of the cattle, which had become her favorite part of the day. "You look like you've been doing this your whole life," he said one morning, watching her hold Bess steady while a group of young steers shuffled past. "I look like nothing of the sort," she said, amused. "I look like a Boston seamstress who has been practicing very hard." "You look like you belong here," he said, and his voice was simple and even and carried everything she needed to understand. She pulled Bess alongside his horse and looked at him in the clear winter morning light and said, "I feel like I belong here," and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the man beside her, and the land that had opened itself to her, and the life that had turned out to be entirely different from what she had contracted for, in every possible way that mattered. Spring came to Red Creek like a held breath finally released, the snow retreating in fits and starts, the creek running high and cold and full of the season's conviction, the cattle looking leaner from winter but sound and healthy, the kitchen garden waking up under Eleanor's careful attention with the first shoots of onion and the pale green insistence of early peas. And in the first warm week of April, standing in the kitchen garden in the morning light with her hands still in the soil, Eleanor understood something about herself that required revision to virtually every practical conclusion she had ever drawn. She was going to have a baby. She sat back on her heels and put one clean hand against her middle and counted weeks carefully, the way she did everything, and the count was very clear. She felt a complicated cascade of emotions that she did not attempt to sort immediately, but simply let move through her: surprise and something that was unmistakably joy, and an uncertainty about how to tell Cole that made her realize she cared very much how he would receive the news, which itself told her something she had already known for months. She told him that evening after supper, when Tom and Espe had gone to their bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet and Cole was reading by the fire. She simply said his name and he looked up and she said, "I think we're going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then he set his book down on the side table with careful precision, and he stood, and he crossed to where she stood in the lamplight, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression of such complete openness, such unguarded joy, that she felt her throat tighten with an emotion she was not going to cry about, except that she apparently was, a little. "Eleanor," he said, and then he put his arms around her and held her, not dramatically, not with any performance of feeling, just the way a man holds something that is everything to him and that he intends never to let fall. She pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, and thought about the woman who had sat in Mr. Fitch's office in Abilene nearly a year ago, and signed a business contract with a steady hand and a closed heart, and felt something like deep and private gratitude toward that woman for having been brave enough to do it, even for the wrong reasons. The summer of 1874 was a good one at Red Creek. Cole had expanded the herd as he had planned, buying 10 additional head from the Miller spread and acquiring 3 fine breeding cows from a sale in Abilene, and the cattle were fat and well grazed, and the fall sale would be strong. Tom and Espe managed most of the heavy work without complaint, both of them visibly pleased by the general improvement in the atmosphere of the ranch, and Tom in particular had appointed himself a sort of unofficial protector of Eleanor's welfare, appearing frequently at the kitchen door with offerings of firewood or asking if she needed anything from town on his supply runs, with the devoted solicitousness of a man who has decided a person is family. Eleanor managed the household accounts and continued her involvement in the business decisions of the ranch, and Cole consulted her on everything as a matter of course and not ceremony, which she considered the only acceptable arrangement. She also began teaching herself to preserve and prepare a wider range of foods from what the garden and the land provided, building a practical knowledge of frontier housekeeping that she found engaged her in the same way a good problem always engaged her. Her body changed, and she watched it with the same interested attention she gave everything, and the child moved inside her in the late summer evenings when she sat on the porch with Cole, while the great Kansas sky turned colors she still did not have adequate words for, and sometimes Cole would rest his hand lightly on her middle and feel the movement with an expression of quiet wonder that never entirely faded no matter how many times it happened. They talked, in those summer evenings, about everything and nothing. About his father and about her father, and about what they hoped to be as parents, about books and about cattle markets and about the coming winter. about the kind of people they had been before they came to Red Creek together and the kind they were becoming. Cole was not a man who spoke easily about his interior life, but he had learned, she thought, that she was a person who would not misuse what he offered, and so he offered more. She, who had always used practicality as both armor and weapon, had learned that she did not need either with him, and so she put them down. "You know," she said one evening, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky while Cole's hand rested warm and steady over hers on the porch railing, "when I signed that contract I made a list, a mental list of what I expected. What was on it? Shelter, food, reasonable treatment." She looked up at the stars. It was a very short list. And now, she considered this with the seriousness she gave all genuine questions. Now the list is so long and so different from what I imagined that the original document is essentially unrecognizable. She turned to look at him. "I consider this an improvement." He looked at her in the dusk, this man who had treated a marriage contract like a sacred vow from the moment he signed it, who had meant everything he said and said very little he did not mean, who had given her a home and a life and his honest self without reservation or performance. "Eleanor Harding," he said softly, "I love you." She had known it. She had known it for months in the way you know things that live in your body rather than your head. And she had been sitting with it, the word and the feeling both, waiting until she was entirely sure she could say it truly and not practically, not strategically, not as a response to circumstances, but as the plain and absolute truth of her interior life. "I love you," she said, and the straightforwardness of it, the lack of qualification, felt like the most honest thing she had ever said. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the warm summer night with the stars coming fully out above the Kansas plains, and felt something she could only call complete. Their son was born on the 3rd of October, 1874, when the cottonwoods along Red Creek were at the height of their gold, and the air had the particular clean sharpness of early fall. Mary Miller served as midwife, having considerable experience with the matter, and the labor was long but not dangerous. And when Cole was finally allowed into the room and saw Eleanor exhausted and triumphant against the pillows with the small, red-faced boy in her arms, he stood in the doorway for a moment and collected himself with the particular visible effort of a man who does not weep, but is close to it. "Come here," Eleanor said, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms with the careful transfer of something infinitely valuable, and he held the child with the same care he gave everything, and looked down at his son with an expression that required no interpretation. "Daniel," she said, "for your father." He looked up at her. "Daniel," he agreed, in a voice that was not entirely steady, and she reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it briefly and closed his eyes. Tom and Espes celebrated with a considerable amount of noise from the direction of the barn, audible all the way to the house, which made Eleanor laugh despite her exhaustion. Mary Miller declared the baby the finest she had seen in some time, which was probably not objectively true, but was received with appropriate gratitude. Frank Miller shook Cole's hand with the simple, wholehearted warmth of a good man who is genuinely glad for another good man's fortune. Red Creek changed again with Daniel in it, which was to say it deepened. The sounds of the house changed, and the rhythms of life rearranged themselves around this new and entirely demanding presence, and Eleanor threw herself into motherhood with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, learning as she went, making mistakes she analyzed and corrected, discovering capacities for tenderness she had not known she possessed in such quantity. Cole was a father of the same kind. He was a husband, unhurried and attentive and entirely present, and there was something about watching him with Daniel that reached Eleanor in places she had previously kept very well defended. He would carry the baby on his morning rounds of the property when the weather permitted, the child bundled against him, talking quietly about what they were looking at, the cattle and the horses and the creek and the sky, as if the baby could understand every word and simply needed to be informed. "He can't understand you," Eleanor told him one morning, amused. "No," Cole agreed, not stopping. "But he can hear my voice, and he'll recognize this land when he's older, and it won't be strange to him." She stood watching them for a moment, her husband and her son moving through the pale morning light toward the barn, and felt something move through her so large and warm that the word love seemed almost too small for it, though she could not think of a better one. The seasons turned again. Daniel grew from a red-faced newborn into a sturdy, bright-eyed toddler with his father's dark coloring and his mother's tendency to observe before acting. The ranch prospered steadily. Cole bought additional land to the north, a parcel that had belonged to an older couple who were returning to their family in Ohio, and the creek corridor was secure, the riparian rights registered and legally sound. Tom had begun courting a young woman from the Miller family's extended circle, a development that pleased everyone concerned, and Espe had sent for a cousin from Texas who came up in the summer of 1876 and proved as good a worker as his relation. Eleanor had, over these years, become something she had not foreseen, a woman of this land, as thoroughly as if she had been born to it. She knew the creek's moods and the cattle's patterns, and the way the weather moved across the plains from the west, with particular characteristic gestures she had learned to read. She knew the names of the prairie grasses, and which wildflowers appeared in which order in spring, and how to treat a minor cut or fever with the stores she kept in the kitchen cabinet, having learned herbal and practical medicine from Mary Miller, and from a small medical manual she had obtained from the Abilene dry goods store. She also knew, with the same precision she had always applied to her accounting, that she wanted another child. She and Cole talked about it one evening in the spring of 1876, with Daniel asleep upstairs and the fire low and comfortable in the grate. And it was the sort of conversation that practical people have when they have also become people who love each other entirely. A conversation that was at once matter-of-fact and deeply personal, laced with the easy familiarity of people who have spent 3 years knowing each other very well. Their daughter arrived in December of 1876, during a snowstorm that kept the roads impassable and necessitated Cole delivering the child himself, with Mary Miller shouting instructions through the window from the porch, where Frank Miller had managed to get her before the roads closed completely, which was a more complicated arrangement than any of them had anticipated and resulted in a story that would be told at Miller Harding gatherings for the next 20 years. Ellie, they called her, because Eleanor had a private and unexamined softness for the idea of her own name carried forward in a different form, and Cole said it suited her, which it did, because Ellie Harding came into the world with considerable volume and a specific quality of insistence that suggested she had views and intended to express them. Cole held the baby while Eleanor recovered, and Daniel, now 2.5, climbed into the bed beside his mother and stared at his sister with an expression of complex evaluation that made Eleanor think he had inherited rather too much of her own approach to new information. "She is very loud," he observed. "She is," Eleanor agreed. "She is small," he added. "You are also small." He considered this. "Will she get bigger?" "She will." "Good," he said, apparently satisfied, and leaned against Eleanor's shoulder and went to sleep. Cole looked at this arrangement from the chair beside the bed where he sat with the baby, and the expression on his face was the one Eleanor had learned was his version of perfectly happy, quiet and steady and full to the edges. She reached across and touched his hand, and he turned it over and held hers. The years that followed were the years in which the ranch became undeniably and completely home in the way that is not about a deed of ownership, but about the accumulation of lived experience, of meals and seasons and laughter and difficulty, and the specific worn softness of things that have been much used and much valued. Daniel grew into a boy who loved horses and numbers equally, who followed Cole to the barn in the mornings, and followed Eleanor to the kitchen accounts in the afternoons, and who seemed to have determined that life contained no contradiction between these two pursuits. Ellie grew into a person of such definite opinion, and such complete disregard for the opinions of anyone who disagreed with her, that Eleanor recognized her with tender familiarity, and Cole watched his daughter with an expression of quiet delight whenever she argued her case on any subject, which was often. There were hard years, too, because this was Kansas and this was ranching and this was the 1870s, and life did not insulate itself against difficulty simply because you were happy in it. There was a drought year that stressed the cattle and stretched the finances, and required real and unpleasant decisions about which animals to sell and which improvements to defer. There was a winter when Eleanor was sick with a chest illness that frightened Cole in a way he expressed by not leaving the house for 11 days, and by making himself available for every task she might need without being asked, which was both the most useful and most telling response possible. She recovered fully, and afterwards he told her, quietly and without drama, that those 11 days had been the worst of his life, which told her more about the depth of what they had built than any number of declarations might have done. Mary Miller's husband Frank died in 1878 of a fall from a barn roof, and the loss of him moved through the community like a genuine wound, because he was that rare thing, a thoroughly good man whom everyone liked and no one envied. Cole and Tom spent a week at the Miller Ranch helping Mary manage what needed managing, and Eleanor was at Mary's side for everything else. And Mary, who was a strong woman in the bone-deep way of people who have chosen a hard life on purpose, did not break, but was grateful in the specific way of someone who knows the difference between help offered and help given. They supported each other, the ranching families along Red Creek, in the way that communities built by necessity and maintained by choice tend to do, with the honest acknowledgement that they needed each other, and the equal acknowledgement that they were glad of each other. Eleanor, who had arrived in this country as a stranger with a leather trunk and a business contract, and a firm belief that she needed no one very much, had become someone who understood need and offered, and received it without either shame or performance. By 1879, Red Creek Ranch was one of the more established operations in the region. The herd was strong. The land was fully in use and producing. Cole had built a proper root cellar and expanded the house with an additional bedroom and a proper parlor that Eleanor had made genuinely pleasant with the care of someone who knows that beauty is not frivolous but necessary. Tom Waverly had married his young woman, a capable and good-humored person named Bess, and coincidence of name that Eleanor found quietly amusing, and the Waverleys had built a small house a quarter-mile down the road and were raising their own family on land Cole had parceled from the North acquisition. Espe had gone back to Texas the previous year, following family, and they had seen him off with genuine affection, and a hamper of provisions from Eleanor's kitchen that he had seemed genuinely moved by. The cousin, whose name was Raphael, had stayed on, and had become as much a fixture of the ranch as Tom had ever been. One afternoon in the fall of 1879, Cole and Eleanor rode out together to the far south pasture as they often did, with Daniel at school in the small schoolhouse that the community had built 3 years prior, and Ellie being minded by Bess Waverly, and they sat their horses at the top of the long, gentle rise that overlooked the best sweep of the ranch, the creek bright in the autumn light, the cattle scattered across the pasture below. The house visible to the north with its good stone and its wide porch and the smoke from the kitchen fire moving in the clear air. Eleanor looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. "What are you thinking?" Cole asked. She turned to look at him, this man she had married in a white church in Abilene for entirely the wrong reasons, this man who had known from the beginning that the vow was not a business document but a pledge of himself, who had been patient with her while she found her way to understanding the same thing. His hair was properly shot through with a thread of silver at the temples now, which she thought suited him. His eyes were the same dark, steady, unhurried eyes that had watched her sign her name to a contract, and then stood in that doorway and looked at her with an expression she had eventually understood, was the beginning of this. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I was the most fortunate woman alive to have been practical enough to take a risk." He looked at her with that quiet, warm expression that was entirely his, that she had been watching for 6 years and that still made something move through her from behind her sternum. "That's one way to put it," he said. "What's your way?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land below them, the life they had built on it. "I signed my name to a piece of paper," he said, "and I meant every word of it. And then I got to watch you become everything I didn't know enough to ask for." He turned to look at her. "I think that makes me the lucky one." She reached across the space between their horses and he took her hand, and they sat like that for a long time on the ridge above Red Creek, looking at their land in the October light. And Eleanor felt the whole completed shape of her life around her, not as she had planned it, not as she had contracted for it, but as it had become, which was so much larger and warmer and more entirely hers than anything the practical woman in Mr. Fitch's office could have calculated. That Christmas, with Daniel home from school for the holiday and Ellie conducting herself as the unambiguous center of all festivities, and the house full of the smell of pine and roasting meat and the good sweet preserves from the cellar, they sat after the children were asleep at the table with coffee and the remnant of the evening, and Cole reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folded paper and set it on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it. "What is this?" "Something I wrote," he said, which for a man who had declared himself not much for writing carried a certain weight. She unfolded it. It was not a long document. It was a page of his careful, plain handwriting, and it began to Eleanor Harding from her husband, who means this as truly as any word he has ever spoken. And what followed was not a legal instrument and not a business contract, but a simple and entirely honest account of what she was to him, and what their life was to him, and what he intended for the years ahead, written in the direct, economical language of a man who chooses his words because they matter rather than because they perform. She read it twice. She set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and she did not attempt to be clinical about it. "Cole Harding," she said. "Eleanor Harding," he replied. "You wrote this." "I did. You said you weren't much for letters." "I said that in 1873, he said. "I've had 6 years of education since then." She laughed, warm and full, and reached across the table, and he met her halfway and they held hands across the Christmas table with the fire low in the hearth, and the house breathing quietly around them. And what she felt was something that had no practical name and required none. The simple, enormous, completed thing of a life lived alongside the right person. Spring came to Red Creek in 1880 with the particular extravagance of a good year announcing itself early. The creek running full and clear, the cattle calving without difficulty, the kitchen garden sending up its first brave shoots before April was properly settled. Eleanor stood one morning in the garden with her hands in the warm soil and the smell of new growth all around her, and she was aware of a familiar and now welcome understanding in her body, a knowledge that had arrived twice before, and that she received now with immediate joy, rather than the complicated cascade of emotion that had attended the first discovery 7 years ago. She found Cole in the barn, overseeing Raphael with a new calf that had arrived overnight and required some attention. She waited until the calf was settled, and Raphael had gone for additional feed, and then she said, "I have something to tell you." He turned from the calf and looked at her face and knew immediately, because he had learned to read her with the thoroughness of long attention and deep love, and the expression that moved across his face was the same open, unguarded joy it had been the first time and the second time, not diminished by repetition but deepened by it. "A third," he said. "A third," she agreed. He crossed the distance between them and held her face in his hands and looked at her with eyes that were absolutely clear and warm and entirely committed to her, and said, "Eleanor, you have given me everything I did not know to want." She put her hands over his on her face. "You gave me the same," she said. "You gave me it first." He kissed her in the barn with the morning light coming through the high windows and the new calf shuffling in its stall, and the whole spring world outside making its bright and busy noise. And she kissed him back with the full and unguarded heart of a woman who had learned the extraordinary difference between what she had contracted for and what she had been given. Their second son, James Daniel Harding, arrived in December of 1880, a quiet and serious-faced baby who looked at the world with the precise attention of someone conducting an important assessment, which Eleanor recognized immediately, and which made Cole laugh with a warmth that filled the room. Daniel, who was 6 and old enough to feel the full magnitude of his position as eldest, took his responsibilities with great seriousness. Ellie, who was 4 and constitutionally opposed to anything that was not her idea, was initially resistant to the addition of another sibling, and then, within approximately a week, completely enchanted by the baby and proprietary about him in a way that would not abate for the rest of her considerable and eventful life. The house on Red Creek Ranch held all of them, the children and their noise and their growing and their particular characters, and Cole and Eleanor at the center of it all, and what existed between them had by 1880 become something with the density and permanence of good stone, built over years of actual life, of difficulty and joy, and the accumulating weight of shared experience. It was nothing like what a practical woman had contracted for in a land office in Abilene. It was so much more than that. Cole still read in the evenings, and she still sewed, and the silence between them was still the comfortable kind, except now it was interrupted regularly by the sounds of 3 children who had considerable opinions about when the evening should end. He still brought her small practical gifts from his supply runs, things she needed but had not thought to ask for, with the unfailing attentiveness of a man who pays attention because the person matters. She still managed the accounts and weighed in on the business decisions and rode out with him on the best mornings, and they still sat together on the porch in the summer evenings and watched the sky do the things that Kansas skies do, which are always worth watching. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, in July of 1880, Cole came to the table for supper and found it set with the good china they kept for particular occasions and a candle lit in the center, and Eleanor in the dress she had been wearing the evening of that dinner in Abilene, which still fit her, being a practical woman who did not waste things. The children had been fed early and were in the care of Bess Waverly for the night, an arrangement Eleanor had organized with the quiet efficiency she brought to all logistical matters. Cole looked at the table and at her and smiled the real, unhurried smile she had first seen across a Kansas restaurant table 7 years ago, and which still did precisely what it had always done to her composure. "What's the occasion?" he asked. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed, sitting down and looking across the candle-lit table at his wife with the full attention he had always given her and had never stopped. "How does the contract look?" She considered this with mock seriousness. "Completely unrecognizable from the original document," she said. "The terms have been substantially revised." "In whose favor?" She looked at him in the candlelight, this man who had meant what he signed, who had treated a business arrangement as a sacred promise, and waited with patience and complete integrity while she found her way to understanding the same, who had given her a home and a life and 3 children, and the land and his father's ranch and his quiet, steady self, entirely and without reservation. "In mine," she said, and smiled at him with the full and unguarded warmth of a woman who has stopped being practical about the things that matter most, "and in yours, equally." He reached across the table, the same gesture as that dinner in Abilene, and she met his hand with hers, and they sat together in the warm evening light of their home, while the Kansas summer moved outside the windows and the sound of the creek carried faintly on the air, and Red Creek Ranch held them both, as it always had, as it would go on doing through all the seasons yet to come. The contract had been a beginning. What they had made of it was something neither document nor business had any language for, something that belonged entirely to the two of them, and to the land, and to the life they had chosen and gone on choosing, every single day, in the ordinary and extraordinary way of people who have found each other fully and intend never to let that go.